You're listening to Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads. I'm Marilyn of Midwest Coven Cast. Here in Season 3 of Weekend Reads, we will be making our way through the 1922 abridgment of Sir James Frazer's The Golden Bough. You can visit MidwestCovenCast.com to find podcast extras, including a free online copy of the text. Consider supporting Midwest Coven Cast and Weekend Reads on Patreon for access to additional materials, like a serialized official Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads ebook with additional notes about the text and some editorial modernizations straight from, well, me. Now, Coven, it is time to cozy up with your coffee or tea and enjoy this episode of Weekend Reads. Chapter 46, The Corn Mother in Many Lands. Subsection 1. The Corn Mother in America. European peoples, ancient and modern, have not been singular in personifying the corn as a mother goddess. The same simple idea has suggested itself to other agricultural races in distant parts of the world, and has been applied by them to other indigenous cereals than barley and wheat. If Europe has its wheat mother and its barley mother, America has its maize mother, and the East Indies their rice mother. These personifications I will now illustrate, beginning with the American personification of the maize. We have seen that among European peoples, it is a common custom to keep the plaited cornstalks off the last sheaf, or the puppet, which is formed out of them, in the farmhouse from harvest to harvest. The intention, no doubt, is, or rather originally was, by preserving the representative of the corn spirit, to maintain the spirit itself in life and activity throughout the year, in order that the corn may grow and the crops be good. This interpretation of the custom is at all events rendered highly probable by a similar custom observed by the ancient Peruvians, and thus described by the old Spanish historian Acosta. They take a certain portion of the most fruitful of the maize that grows in their farms, the which they put in a certain granary, which they do call pairua. With certain ceremonies, watching 3 nights, they put this maize in the richest garment they have, and being thus wrapped and dressed, they worship this pairua, and hold it in great veneration, saying it is the mother of the maize of their inheritances, and that by this means the maize augments and is preserved. In this month, the 6th month answering to May, they make a particular sacrifice, and the witches demand of this pairua if it hath strength sufficient to continue until the next year. And if it answers no, then they carry this maize to the farm to burn, whence they brought it, according to every man's power. Then they make another pairua, with the same ceremonies, saying that they renew it, to the end the seed of maize may not perish. And if it answers that it hath force sufficient to last longer, they leave it until the next year. This foolish vanity continueth to this day, and it is very common amongst the Indians to have these pairuas. In this description of the custom, there seems to be some error. Probably it was the dressed-up bunch of maize, not the granary, pairua, which was worshipped by the Peruvians and regarded as the mother of the maize. This is confirmed by what we know of the Peruvian custom from another source. The Peruvians, we are told, believed all useful plants to be animated by a divine being who causes their growth. According to the particular plant, these divine beings were called the maize mother, Zara Mama, the quinoa mother, Quinoa Mama, and the coca mother, Coca Mama, and the potato mother, Axo Mama. Figures of these divine mothers were made, respectively, of ears of maize and leaves of the quinoa and coca plants. They were dressed in women's clothes and worshipped. Thus, the maize mother was represented by a puppet made of stalks of maize, dressed in full female attire, and the Indians believed that, as mother, it had the power of producing and giving birth to much maize. Probably, therefore, Acosta misunderstood his informant, and the mother of the maize, which he describes, was not the granary, pairua, but the bunch of maize dressed in rich vestments. The Peruvian mother of the maize, like the harvest maiden at Balquadir, was kept for a year in order that by her means the corn might grow and multiply. But lest her strength might not suffice to last till the next harvest, she was asked in the course of the year how she felt, and if she answered that she felt weak, she was burned and a fresh mother of the maize made, to the end the seed of maize may not perish. Here, it may be observed, we have a strong confirmation of the explanation already given of the custom of killing the god, both periodically and occasionally. The mother of the maize was allowed, as a rule, to live through a year, that being the period during which her strength might reasonably be supposed to last unimpaired. But on any symptom of her strength failing, she was put to death, and a fresh and vigorous mother of the maize took her place, lest the maize, which depended on her for its existence, should languish and decay. Subsection 2. The the rice mother in the East Indies. If the reader still feels any doubts as to the meaning of the harvest customs which have been practiced within living memory by European peasants, these doubts may perhaps be dispelled by comparing the customs observed at the rice harvest by the Malays and Dyaks of the East Indies. For these Eastern peoples have not, like our peasantry, advanced beyond the intellectual stage at which the customs originated. Their theory and their practice are still in unison. For them, the quaint rites, which in Europe have long dwindled into mere fossils, the pastime of clowns and the puzzle of the learned, are still living realities of which they can render an intelligible and truthful account. Hence, a study of their beliefs and usages concerning the rice may throw some light on the true meaning of the ritual of the corn in ancient Greece and modern Europe. Now, the whole of the ritual which the Malays and Dyaks observe in connection with the rice is founded on the simple conception of the rice as animated by a soul like that which these people attribute to mankind. They explain the phenomena of reproduction, growth, decay, and death in the rice on the same principles on which they explain the corresponding phenomena in human beings. They imagine that in the fibers of the plant, as in the body of a man, there is a certain vital element, which is so far independent of the plant that it may for a time be completely separated from it without fatal effects, though if its absence be prolonged beyond certain limits, the plant will wither and die. This vital, yet separable element is what, for the want of a better word, we must call the soul of a plant, just as a similar vital and separable element is commonly supposed to constitute the soul of man, and on this theory or myth of the plant soul is built the whole worship of the cereals, just as on the theory or myth of the human soul is built the whole worship of the dead, a towering superstructure, reared on a slender and precarious foundation. Believing the rice to be animated by a soul like that of man, the Indonesians naturally treat it with the deference and the consideration which they show to their fellows. Thus, they behave towards the rice in bloom as they behave towards a pregnant woman. They abstain from firing guns or making loud noises in the field, lest they should so frighten the soul of the rice that it would miscarry and bear no grain. And for the same reason, they will not talk of corpses or demons in the rice fields. Moreover, they feed the blooming rice with foods of various kinds, which are believed to be wholesome for women with child. But when the rice ears are just beginning to form, they are looked upon as infants, and women go through the fields feeding them with rice pap, as if they were human babes. In such natural and obvious comparisons of the breeding plant to a breeding woman and the young grain to a young child is to be sought the origin of the kindred Greek conception of the corn mother and the corn daughter, Demeter and Persephone. But if the timorous feminine soul of the rice can be frightened into a miscarriage even by loud noises, it is easy to imagine what her feelings must be at harvest when people are under the sad necessity of cutting down the rice with the knife. At so critical a season, every precaution must be used to render the necessary surgical operation of reaping as inconspicuous and as painless as possible. For that reason, the reaping of the seed rice is done with knives of a peculiar pattern, such that the blades are hidden in the reaper's hand, and do not frighten the rice spirit till the very last moment, when her head is swept off almost before she is aware. And from a like delicate motive, the reapers at work in the fields employ a special form of speech, which the rice spirit cannot be expected to understand, so that she has no warning or inkling of what is going forward till the heads of rice are safely deposited in the basket. Among the Indonesian peoples who thus personify the rice, we may take the Kayans or Boughs of central Borneo as typical. In order to secure and detain the volatile soul of the rice, the Kayans resort to a number of devices. Among the instruments employed for this purpose are a miniature ladder, a spatula, and a basket containing hooks, thorns, and cords. With the spatula, the priestess strokes the soul of the rice down the little ladder into the basket, where it is naturally held fast by the hooks, the thorn, and the cord, and having thus captured and imprisoned the soul, she conveys it into the rice granary. Sometimes a bamboo box and a net are used for the same purpose, and in order to ensure a good harvest for the following year, it is necessary not only to detain the soul of all the grains of rice, which are safely stored in the granary, but also to attract and recover the soul of all the rice that has been lost through falling to the earth or being eaten by deer, apes, and pigs. For this purpose, instruments of various sorts have been invented by the priests. One, for example, is a bamboo vessel provided with 4 hooks, made from the wood of a fruit tree, by means of which the absent rice soul may be hooked and drawn back into the vessel. which is then hung up in the house. Sometimes 2 hands carved out of the wood of a fruit tree are used for the same purpose, and every time that a Cayenne housewife fetches rice from the granary for the use of her household, she must propitiate the souls of the rice in the granary, lest they should be angry at being robbed of their substance. The same need of securing the soul of the rice if the crop is to thrive is cleanly felt by the Karens of Burma. When a rice field does not flourish, they suppose that the soul, kela, of the rice is in some way detained from the rice. If the soul cannot be called back, the crop will fail. The following formula is used in recalling the kela, soul, of the rice. "O come, rice kela, come. Come to the field, come to the rice. With a seed of each gender, come. Come from the river Ko, come from the river Ka, from the place where they meet, come. Come from the west, come from the east, from the throat of the bird, from the maw of the ape, from the throat of the elephant. Come from the sources of rivers and their mouths. Come from the country of the Shan and Burma. From the distant kingdoms come, from all granaries, come, O rice Kela, come to the rice." The corn mother of our European peasants has her match in the rice mother of the Minangkabauers of Sumatra. The Minangkabauers definitely attribute a soul to rice, and will sometimes assert that rice pounded in the usual way tastes better than rice ground in a mill, because in the mill the body of the rice was so bruised and battered that the soul has fled from it. Like the Javanese, they think that the rice is under the special guardianship of a female spirit called Saning Sari, who is conceived as so closely knit up with the plant that the rice often goes by her name. As with the Romans, the corn might be called Ceres. In particular, Saning Sari is represented by certain stalks or grains called Inoea Padi, that is, literally, mother of rice, a name that is often given to the guardian spirit herself. This so-called mother of rice is the occasion of a number of ceremonies observed at the planting and harvesting of the rice, as well as during its preservation in the barn. When the seed of the rice is about to be sown in the nursery or bedding out ground, there under the wet system of cultivation it is regularly allowed to sprout before being transplanted to the fields. The best grains are picked out to form the rice mother. These are then sown in the middle of the bed, and the common seed is planted round about them. The state of the rice mother is supposed to exert the greatest influence on the growth of the rice. If she droops or pines away, the harvest will be bad in consequence. The woman who sows the rice mother in the nursery lets her hair hang loose and afterwards bathes as a means of ensuring an abundant harvest. When the time comes to transplant the rice from the nursery to the field, the rice mother receives a special place either in the middle or in a corner of the field, and a prayer or charm is uttered as follows: "Saning Sari, may a measure of rice come from a stalk of rice, and a basketful from a root. May you be frightened neither by lightning nor by passers-by. Sunshine make you glad. With the storm may you be at peace, and may rain serve to wash your face." While the rice is growing, the particular plant, which was thus treated as the rice mother, is lost sight of. But before harvest another rice mother is found. When the crop is ripe for cutting, the oldest woman of the family or a sorcerer goes out to look for her. The first stalks seen to bend under a passing breeze are the rice mother, and they are tied together but not cut until the first fruits of the field have been carried home to serve as a festal meal for the family and their friends, nay, even for the domestic animals, since it is Saning Sari's pleasure that the beasts also should partake of her good gifts. After the meal has been eaten, the rice mother is fetched home by persons in gay attire, who carry her very carefully under an umbrella in a neatly worked bag to the barn, where a place in the middle is assigned to her. Everyone believes that she takes care of the rice in the barn and even multiplies it, not uncommonly. When the Tomari of Central Celebes are about to plant the rice, they bury in the field some betel as an offering to the spirits who cause the rice to grow. The rice that is planted round this spot is the last to be reaped at harvest. At the commencement of the reaping, the stalks of this patch of rice are tied together into a sheaf, which is called the mother of the rice, in Nenope, and offerings in the shape of rice, fowl's liver, eggs, and other things are laid down before it. When all the rest of the rice in the field has been reaped, the mother of the rice is cut down and carried with due honor to the rice barn, where it is laid on the floor and all the other sheaves are piled upon it. The Tomari, we are told, regard the mother of the rice as a special offering made to the rice spirit Omonga, who dwells in the moon. If that spirit is not treated with proper respect, for example, if the people who fetch rice from the barn are not decently clad, he is angry and punishes the offenders by eating up twice as much rice in the barn as they have taken out of it. Some people have heard him smacking his lips in the barn as he devoured the rice. On the other hand, the Torajas of Central Celebes, who also practice the custom of the rice mother at harvest, regard her as the actual mother of the whole harvest, and therefore keep her carefully, lest in her absence the garnered store of rice should all melt away and disappear. Again, just as in Scotland, the old and the young spirit of the corn are represented as an old wife, Cailleach, and a maiden respectively. So in the Malay Peninsula, we find both the rice mother and her child represented by different sheaves or bundles of ears on the harvest field. The ceremony of cutting and bringing home the soul of the rice was witnessed by Mr. W. W. Skeet at Chadoy in Selangor on the 28th of January, 1897. The particular bunch or sheaf, which was to serve as the mother of the rice, soul, had previously been sought and identified by means of the markings or shape of the ears. From this sheaf an aged sorceress, with much solemnity, cut a little bundle of 7 ears, anointed them with oil, tied them round with party-colored thread, fumigated them with incense, and having wrapped them in a white cloth, deposited them in a little oval-shaped basket. These 7 ears were the infant soul of the rice, and the little basket was its cradle. It was carried home to the farmer's house by another woman, who held up an umbrella to screen the tender infant from the hot rays of the sun. Arrived at the house, the rice child was welcomed by the women of the family and laid, cradle and all, on a new sleeping mat, with pillows at the head. After that, the farmer's wife was instructed to observe certain rules of taboo for 3 days, the rules being in many respects identical with those which have to be observed for 3 days after the birth of a real child. Something of the same tender care, which is thus bestowed on the newly born rice child, is naturally extended also to its parent, the sheaf from whose body it was taken. This sheaf, which remains standing in the field after the rice soul has been carried home and put to bed, is treated as a newly made mother. That is to say, young shoots of trees are pounded together and scattered broadcast every evening for 3 successive days. And when the 3 days are up, you take the pulp of a coconut and what are called goat flowers, mix them up, eat them with a little sugar, and spit some of the mixture out among the rice. So, after a real birth, the young shoots of the jackfruit, the rose apple, certain kinds of banana, and the thin pulp of young coconuts are mixed with dried fish, salt, acid, prawn condiment, and the like dainties to form a sort of salad, which is administered to mother and child for 3 successive days. The last sheaf is reaped by the farmer's wife, who carries it back to the house, where it is threshed and mixed with the rice soul. The farmer then takes the rice soul in its basket and deposits it, together with the product of the last sheaf, in the big circular rice bin used by the Malays. Some grains from the rice soul are mixed with the seed which is to be sown in the following year. In this rice mother and rice child of the Malay Peninsula, we may see the counterpart, and in a sense the prototype of the Demeter and Persephone of ancient Greece. Once more, the European custom of representing the corn spirit in the double form of bride and bridegroom has its parallel in a ceremony observed in the rice harvest in Java. Before the reapers begin to cut the rice, the priest or sorcerer picks out a number of ears of rice, which are tied together, smeared with ointment, and adorned with flowers. Thus decked out, the ears are called the Padi Payangantan, that is, the rice bride and the rice bridegroom. Their wedding feast is celebrated, and the cutting of the rice begins immediately afterwards. Later on, when the rice is being got in, a bridal chamber is partitioned off in the barn, and furnished with a new mat, a lamp, and all kinds of toilet articles. Sheaves of rice, to represent the wedding guests, are placed beside the rice bride and the rice bridegroom. Not till this has been done may the whole harvest be housed in the barn, and for the first 40 days after the rice has been housed, no one may enter the barn for fear of disturbing the newly wedded pair. In the island of Bali and Lombok, when the time of harvest has come, the owner of the field himself makes a beginning by cutting the principal rice with his own hands and binding it into 2 sheaves, each composed of 108 stalks, with their leaves attached to them. One of the sheaves represents a man, and the other a woman, and they are called husband and wife. The male sheaf is wound about with threads, so that none of the leaves are visible, whereas the female sheaf has its leaves bent over and tied, so as to resemble the roll of a woman's hair. Sometimes, for further distinction, a necklace of rice straw is tied round the female sheaf. When the rice is brought home from the field, the two sheaves representing the husband and wife are carried by a woman on her head, and are the last of all to be deposited in the barn. There they are laid to rest on a small erection or on a cushion of rice straw. The whole arrangement, we are informed, has for its object to induce the rice to increase and multiply in the granary, so that the owner may get more out of it than he put in. Hence, when the people of Bough bring the two sheaves, the husband and wife, into the barn, they say, "Increase ye and multiply without ceasing." When all the rice in the barn has been used up, the two sheaves representing the husband and wife remain in the empty building till they have gradually disappeared or been devoured by mice. The pinch of hunger sometimes drives individuals to eat up the rice of these two sheaves, but the wretches who do so are viewed with disgust by their fellows and branded as pigs and dogs. Nobody would ever sell these holy sheaves with the rest of their profane brethren. The same notion of the propagation of the rice by a male and female power finds expression amongst the Zizis of Upper Burma, when the paddy, that is, the rice with the husk still on it, has been dried and piled in a heap for threshing. All the friends of the household are invited to the threshing floor. The food and drink are brought out. The heap of paddy is divided and one half spread out for threshing, while the other half is left piled up. On the pile food and spirits are set, and one of the elders, addressing the father and mother of the paddy plant, prays for plenteous harvests in future, and begs that the seed may bear many fold. Then the whole party eat, drink, and make merry. The ceremony at the threshing floor is the only occasion when these people invoke the father and mother of the paddy. Subsection 3. The spirit of the corn embodied in human beings. Thus the theory which recognizes in the European corn mother, corn maiden, and so forth, the embodiment in vegetable form of the animating spirit of the crops, is amply configured by the evidence of peoples in other parts of the world, who, because they have lagged behind the European races in mental development, retain for that very reason a keener sense of the original motives for observing those rustic rites, which among ourselves have sunk to the level of meaningless survivals. The reader may, however, remember that according to Manhart, whose theory I am expounding, the spirit of the corn manifests itself not merely in vegetable but also in human form. The person who cuts the last sheaf or gives the last stroke at threshing passes for a temporary embodiment of the corn spirit, just as much as the bunch of corn which he reaps or threshes. Now, in the parallels which have been hitherto adduced from the customs of peoples outside Europe, the spirit of the crops appears only in vegetable form. It remains, therefore, to prove that other races besides our European peasantry have conceived the spirit of the crops as incorporate in or represented by living men and women. Such a proof, I may remind the reader, is germane to the theme of this book, for the more instances we discover of human beings representing in themselves the life or animating spirit of plants, the less difficulty will be felt at classing amongst them the king of the wood at Nemi. The Mandans and Minnetarees of North America used to hold a festival in spring which they called the Corn Medicine Festival of the Women. They thought that a certain old woman who never dies made the crops to grow, and that, living somewhere in the south, she sent the migratory waterfowl in spring as her tokens and representatives. Each sort of bird represented a special kind of crop cultivated by the Indians. The wild goose stood for the maize, the wild swan for the gourds, and the wild duck for the beans. So, when the feathered messengers of the old woman began to arrive in spring, the Indians celebrated the Corn Medicine Festival of the Women. Scaffolds were set up, on which the people hung dried meat and other things by way of offerings to the old woman, and on a certain day the old women of the tribe, as representatives of the old woman who never dies, assembled at the scaffolds, each bearing in their hand an ear of maize fastened to a stick. They first planted these sticks in the ground, then danced around the scaffolds, and finally took up the sticks again in their arms. Meanwhile, old men beat drums and shook rattles as musical accompaniment to the performance of the old women. Further, young women came and put dried flesh into the mouths of the old women, for which they received in return a grain of the consecrated maize to eat. 3 or 4 grains of the holy corn were also placed in the dishes of the young women, to be afterwards carefully mixed with the seed corn, which they were supposed to fertilize. The dried flesh hung on the scaffold belonged to the old women, because they represented the old woman who never dies. A similar corn medicine festival was held in autumn for the purpose of attracting the herds of buffaloes and securing a supply of meat. At that time, every woman carried in her arms an uprooted plant of maize. They gave the name of the old woman who never dies, both to the maize and to those birds which they regarded as symbols of the fruits of the earth, and they prayed to them in autumn, saying, Mother, have pity on us, send us not the bitter cold too soon, lest we have not meat enough. Let not all the game depart, that we may have something for the winter. In autumn, when the birds were flying south, the Indians thought that they were going home to the old woman and taking to her the offerings that had been hung up on the scaffolds, especially the dried meat, which she ate. Here, then, we have the spirit or divinity of the corn conceived as an old woman and represented in bodily form by old women, who in their capacity of representatives receive some at least of the offerings which are intended for her. In some parts of India, the harvest goddess Gauri is represented at once by an unmarried girl and by a bundle of wild balsam plants, which is made up into the figure of a woman and dressed as such with mask, garments, and ornaments. Both the human and the vegetable representative of the goddess are worshipped, and the intention of the whole ceremony appears to be to ensure a good crop of rice. Subsection 4. The double personification of the corn as mother and daughter. Compared with the Corn Mother of Germany and the Harvest Maiden of Scotland, the Demeter and Persephone of Greece are late products of religious growth. Yet, as members of the Aryan family, the Greeks must at one time or another have observed harvest customs like those which are still practiced by Celts, Teutons, and Slavs, and which, far beyond the limits of the Aryan world, have been practiced by the Indians of Peru and many peoples of the East Indies. A sufficient proof that the idea on which these customs rest are not confined to any one race, but naturally suggest themselves to all untutored peoples engaged in agriculture. It is probable, therefore, that Demeter and Persephone, those stately and beautiful figures of Greek mythology, grew out of the same simple beliefs and practices which still prevail among our modern peasantry, and that they were represented by rude dolls made out of the yellow sheaves on many a harvest field long before their breathing images were wrought in bronze and marble by the master hands of Phidias and Praxiteles. A reminiscence of that olden time, a scent, so to say, of the harvest field lingered to the last in the title of the maiden Kore, by which Persephone was commonly known. Thus, if the prototype of Demeter is the Corn Mother of Germany, the prototype of Persephone is the Harvest Maiden, which autumn after autumn is still made from the last sheaf on the brace of Balquedir. Indeed, if we knew more about the peasant farmers of ancient Greece, we should probably find that even in classical times they continued annually to fashion their corn mothers, Demeters, and maidens, Persephones, out of the ripe corn on the harvest fields. But unfortunately, the Demeter and Persephone whom we know were the denizens of towns, the majestic inhabitants of lordly temples. It was for such divinities alone that the refined writers of antiquity had eyes. The uncouth rites performed by rustics amongst the corn were beneath their notice. Even if they noticed them, they probably never dreamed of any connection between the puppet of cornstalks on the sunny stubble field and the marble divinity in the shady coolness of the temple. Still, the writings even of these town-bred and cultured persons afford us an occasional glimpse of a Demeter as rude as the rudest that a remote German village can show. Thus the story that Iasion begat a child Plutus, wealth, abundance, by Demeter on a thrice ploughed field, may be compared with the West Prussian custom of the mock birth of a child on the harvest field. In this Prussian custom, the pretended mother represents the corn mother, Zitnia Matka. The pretended child represents the corn baby, and the whole ceremony is a charm to ensure a crop next year. The custom and the legend alike point to an older practice of performing, among the sprouting crops in spring or the stubble in autumn, one of those real or mimic acts of procreation by which, as we have seen, primitive man often seeks to infuse his own vigorous life into the languid or decaying energies of nature. Another glimpse of the savage under the civilized Demeter will be afforded farther on, when we come to deal with another aspect of those agricultural divinities. The reader may have observed that in modern folk customs, the corn spirit is generally represented either by a corn mother, old woman, etc., or by a maiden, harvest child, etc., not both by corn mother and by a maiden. Why then did the Greeks represent the corn both as mother and daughter? In the Breton custom, the mother sheaf, a large figure made out of the last sheaf with a small corn doll inside of it, clearly represents both the corn mother and the corn daughter. the latter still unborn. Again, in the Prussian custom just referred to, the woman who plays the part of the corn mother represents the ripe grain. The child appears to represent next year's corn, which may be regarded, naturally enough, as the child of this year's corn, since it is from the seed of this year's harvest that next year's crop will spring. Further, we have seen that among the Malays of the peninsula, and sometimes among the Highlanders of Scotland, the spirit of the grain is represented in double female form, both as old and young, by means of ears taken alike from the ripe corn. In Scotland, the old spirit of the corn appears as the carline or Cailleach, the young spirit as the maiden, while among the Malays of the peninsula, the two spirits of the rice are definitely related to each other as mother and child. Judged by these analogies, Demeter would be the ripe crop of this year. Persephone would be the seed corn taken from it and sown in autumn to reappear in spring. The descent of Persephone into the lower world would thus be a mythical expression for the sowing of the seed. Her reappearance in spring would signify the sprouting of the young corn. In this way, the Persephone of one year becomes the Demeter of the next, and this may very well have been the original form of the myth. But when, with the advance of religious thought, the corn came to be personified no longer as a being that went through the whole cycle of birth, growth, reproduction, and death within a year, but as an immortal goddess, consistency required that one of the two personifications, the mother or the daughter, should be sacrificed. However, the double conception of the corn as mother and daughter may have been too old and too deeply rooted in the popular mind to be eradicated by logic, and so room had to be found in the reformed myth both for mother and daughter. This was done by assigning to Persephone the character of the corn sown in autumn and sprouting in spring, while Demeter was left to play the somewhat vague part of the heavy mother of the corn, who laments its annual disappearance underground and rejoices over its reappearance in spring. Thus, instead of a regular succession of divine beings, each living a year and then giving birth to her successor, the reformed myth exhibits the conception of two divine and immortal beings, one of whom annually disappears into and reappears from the ground, while the other has little to do but to weep and rejoice at the appropriate seasons. This theory of the double personification of the corn in Greek myth assumes that both personifications, Demeter and Persephone, are original. But if we suppose that the Greek myth started with a single personification, the aftergrowth of a second personification may perhaps be explained as follows. On looking over the harvest customs, which have been passed under review, it may be noticed that they involve two distinct conceptions of the corn spirit. For whereas in some of the customs the corn spirit is treated as immanent in the corn, in others it is regarded as external to it. Thus, when a particular sheaf is called by the name of the corn spirit, and is dressed in clothes and handled with reverence, the spirit is clearly regarded as immanent in the corn. But when the spirit is said to make the crops grow by passing through them, or to blight the grain of those against whom she has a grudge, she is apparently conceived as distinct from, though exercising power over, the corn. Conceived in the latter mode, the corn spirit is in a fair way to become a deity of the corn, if she has not become so already. Of these two conceptions, that of the corn spirit as immanent in the corn is doubtless the older, since the view of nature as animated by indwelling spirits appears to have generally preceded the view of it as controlled by external deities. To put it shortly, animism precedes deism. In the harvest customs of our European peasantry, the corn spirit seems to be conceived now as immanent in the corn and now as external to it. In Greek mythology, on the other hand, Demeter is viewed rather as the deity of the corn than as the spirit immanent in it. The process of thought which leads to the change from the one mode of conception to the other is anthropomorphism, or the gradual investment of the immanent spirit with more and more of the attributes of humanity. As men emerge from savagery, the tendency to humanize their divinities gains strength, and the more human these become, the wider is the breach which severs them from the natural objects of which they were at first merely the animating spirits or souls. But in the progress upwards from the savagery, men of the same generation do not march abreast, and though the new anthropomorphic gods may satisfy the religious wants of the more developed intelligences, the backward members of the community would cling by preference to the old animistic notions. Now, when the spirit of any natural object, such as the corn, has been invested with human qualities, detached from the object and converted into a deity controlling it, the object itself is, by the withdrawal of its spirit, left inanimate. It becomes, so to say, a spiritual vacuum. But the popular fancy, intolerant of such a vacuum, in other words, unable to conceive anything as inanimate, immediately creates a fresh mythical being, with which it peoples the vacant object. Thus, the same natural object comes to be represented in mythology by two distinct beings. First, by the old spirit now separated from it and raised to the rank of a deity. Second, by the new spirit freshly created by the popular fancy to supply the place vacated by the old spirit on its elevation to a higher sphere. In such cases, the problem for mythology is, having got two distinct personifications of the same object, what to do with them. How are their relations to each other to be adjusted, and room found for both in the mythological system? When the old spirit or new deity is conceived as creating or producing the object in question, the problem is easily solved. Since the object is believed to be produced by the old spirit and animated by the new one, the latter, as the soul of the object, must also owe its existence to the former. Thus, the old spirit will stand to the new one as producer to produced, that is, in mythology, as parent to child. And if both spirits are conceived as female, their relation will be that of mother and daughter. In this way, starting from a single personification of the corn as female, mythic fancy might in time reach a double personification of it as mother and daughter. It would be very rash to affirm that this was the way in which the myth of Demeter and Persephone actually took shape, but it seems a legitimate conjecture that the reduplication of deities, of which Demeter and Persephone furnish an example, may sometimes have arisen in the way indicated. For example, among the pairs of deities dealt with in a former part of this work, it has been shown that there are grounds for regarding both Isis and her companion god Osiris as personifications of the corn. On the hypothesis just suggested, Isis would be the old corn spirit, and Osiris would be the newer one, whose relationship to the old spirit was variously explained as that of brother, husband, and son. For, of course, mythology would always be free to account for the coexistence of the two divinities in more ways than one. It may not, however, be forgotten that this proposed explanation of such pairs of deities as Demeter and Persephone, or Isis and Osiris, is purely conjectural, and is only given for what it is worth. Chapter 47. Lytirsis. Subsection 1. Songs of the Corn Reapers. In the preceding pages, an attempt has been made to show that in the Corn Mother and Harvest Maiden of Northern Europe, we have the prototypes of Demeter and Persephone. But an essential feature is still wanting to complete the resemblance. A leading incident in the Greek myth is the death and resurrection of Persephone. It is this incident which, coupled with the nature of the goddess as a deity of vegetation, links the myth with the cult of Adonis, Attis, Osiris, and Dionysus. And it is in virtue of this incident that the myth finds a place in our discussion of the dying god. It remains, therefore, to see whether the conception of the annual death and resurrection of a god, which figures so prominently in these great Greek and Oriental worships, has not also its origin or its analogy in the rustic rites observed by reapers and vine dressers amongst the corn shocks and the vines. Our general ignorance of the popular superstitions and customs of the ancients has already been confessed, but the obscurity which thus hangs over the first beginnings of ancient religion is fortunately dissipated to some extent in the present case. The worships of Osiris, Adonis, and Attis had their respective seats, as we have seen, in Egypt, Syria, and Phrygia. And in each of these countries, certain harvest and vintage customs are known to have been observed, the resemblance of which to each other and to the national rites struck the ancients themselves, and compared with the harvest customs of modern peasants and barbarians, seems to throw some light on the origin of the rites in question. It has been already mentioned, on the authority of Diodorus, that in ancient Egypt the reapers were wont to lament over the first sheaf cut, invoking Isis as the goddess to whom they owed the discovery of corn. To the plaintive song or cry sung or uttered by Egyptian reapers, the Greeks gave the name Maneros, and explained the name by a story that Maneros, the only son of the first Egyptian king, invented agriculture, and dying an untimely death, was thus lamented by the people. It appears, however, that the name Maneros is due to a misunderstanding of the formula Ma-ne-ra, come to the house, which has been discovered in various Egyptian writings, for example, in the dirge of Isis in the Book of the Dead. Hence, we may suppose that the cry, Ma-ne-ra, was chanted by the reapers over the cut corn as a dirge for the death of the corn spirit, Isis or Osiris, and a prayer for its return. As the cry was raised over the first ears reaped, it would seem that the corn spirit was believed by the Egyptians to be present in the first corn cut and to die under the sickle. We have seen that in the Malay Peninsula and Java, the first ears of rice are taken to represent either the soul of the rice or the rice bride and the rice bridegroom. In parts of Russia, the first sheaf is treated much in the same way that the last sheaf is treated elsewhere. It is reaped by the mistress herself, taken home and set in the place of honor near the holy pictures. Afterwards, it is threshed separately, and some of its grain is mixed with the next year's seed corn. In Aberdeenshire, while the last corn cut was generally used to make the clyack sheaf, it was sometimes, though rarely, the first corn cut that was dressed up as a woman and carried home with ceremony. In Phoenicia and Western Asia, a plaintive song, like that chanted by the Egyptian corn reapers, was sung at the vintage and probably, to judge by analogy, also at harvest. This Phoenician song was called by the Greeks Linus or Aelinus, and explained, like Maneros, as a lament for the death of a youth named Linus. According to one story, Linus was brought up by a shepherd, but torn to pieces by his dogs. But, like Maneros, the name Linus, or Aelinus, appears to have originated in a verbal misunderstanding, and to be nothing more than the cry, E lanu, which is, woe to us, which the Phoenicians probably uttered in mourning for Adonis. At least Sappho seems to have regarded Adonis and Linus as equivalent. In Bithynia, a like mournful ditty called Bormus or Boremus was chanted by Mariandian reapers. Bormus was said to have been a handsome youth, the son of King Eupius, or of a wealthy and distinguished man. One summer day, watching the reapers at work in his fields, he went to fetch them a drink of water, and was never heard of more. So the reapers sought for him, calling him in plaintive strains, which they continued to chant at harvest, ever afterwards. Subsection 2. Killing the corn spirit. In Frisia, the corresponding song, sung by harvesters both at reaping and at threshing, was called Lytirsis. According to one story, Lytirsis was a bastard son of Midas, king of Frisia, and dwelt at Selene. He used to reap the corn and had an enormous appetite. When a stranger happened to enter the cornfield or to pass by it, Lytirsis gave him plenty to eat and drink, then took him to the cornfields on the banks of the Meander, and compelled him to reap along with him. Lastly, it was his custom to wrap the stranger in a sheaf, cut off his head with a sickle, and carry away his body, swathed in the cornstalks. But at last Hercules undertook to reap with him, cut off his head with the sickle, and threw his body into the river. As Hercules is reported to have slain Lytirsis in the same way that Lytirsis slew others, we may infer that Lytirsis used to throw the bodies of his victims into the water. According to another version of the story, Lytirsis, a son of Midas, was wont to challenge people to a reaping match with him, and if he vanquished them, he used to thrash them, but one day he met with a stronger reaper who slew him. There are some grounds for supposing that in these stories of Lytirsis, we have the description of a Parisian harvest custom in accordance with which certain persons, especially strangers passing the harvest fields, were regularly regarded as embodiments of the corn spirit, and as such were seized by the reapers, wrapped in sheaves, and beheaded, their bodies bound up in cornstalks, being afterwards thrown into water as a rain charm. The grounds for this supposition are, first, the resemblance of the Lytirsis story to the harvest customs of European peasantry, and, second, the frequency of human sacrifices offered by savage races to promote the fertility of the fields. We will examine these grounds successively, beginning with the former. In comparing this story with the harvest customs of Europe, 3 points deserve special attention, namely, 1. The reaping match and the binding of persons in the sheaves. 2. The killing of the corn spirit or his representatives. 3. The treatment of visitors to the harvest field or of strangers passing it. 1. In regard to the first head, we have seen that in modern Europe, the person who cuts or binds or threshes the last sheaf is often exposed to rough treatment at the hands of his fellow laborers. For example, he's bound up in the last sheaf, and thus encased is carried or carted about, beaten, drenched with water, thrown on a dunghill, and so forth. Or, if he is spared this horseplay, he is at least the subject of ridicule, or is thought to be destined to suffer some misfortune in the course of the year. Hence, the harvesters are naturally reluctant to give the last cut at reaping, or the last stroke at threshing, or to bind the last sheaf, and towards the close of the work, this reluctance produces an emulation among the laborers. each striving to finish his task as fast as possible, in order that he may escape the invidious distinction of being last. For example, in the Mittelmark district of Prussia, when the rye has been reaped and the last sheaves are about to be tied up, the binders stand in 2 rows facing each other, every woman with her sheaf and her straw rope before her. At a given signal, they all tie up their sheaves, and the one who is the last to finish is ridiculed by the rest. Not only so, but her sheaf is made up into human shape and called the old man, and she must carry it home to the farmyard, where the harvesters dance in circle round her and it. Then they take the old man to the farmer and deliver it to him with the words, "We bring the old man to the master. He may keep him till he gets a new one." After that, the old man is set up against a tree, where he remains for a long time, the butt of many jests. At Aschbach in Bavaria, when the reaping is nearly finished, the reapers say, "Now we will drive out the old man." Each of them sets himself to reap a patch of corn as fast as he can. He who cuts the last handful or the last stalk is greeted by the rest with an exulting cry, "You have the old man." Sometimes a black mask is fastened on the reaper's face, and he is dressed in woman's clothes. Or, if the reaper is a woman, she is dressed in man's clothes. A dance follows. At the supper, the old man gets twice as large a portion of the food as the others. The proceedings are similar at threshing. The person who gives the last stroke is said to have the old man. At the supper given to the threshers, he has to eat out of the cream ladle and to drink a great deal. Moreover, he is quizzed and teased in all sorts of ways, till he frees himself from further annoyance by treating the others to brandy or beer. These examples illustrate the contests in reaping, threshing, and binding, which take place amongst the harvesters, from their unwillingness to suffer the ridicule and discomfort incurred by the one who happens to finish his work last. It will be remembered that the person who is last at reaping, binding, or threshing is regarded as the representative of the corn spirit, and this idea is more fully expressed by binding him or her in cornstalks. The latter custom has been already illustrated, but a few more instances may be added. At Kloeksen, near Stettin, the harvesters call out to the woman who binds the last sheaf, "You have the old man and must keep him." As late as the first half of the 19th century, the custom was to tie up the woman herself in peas straw and bring her with music to the farmhouse, where the harvesters danced with her till the peas straw fell off. In other villages around Stettin, when the last harvest wagon is being loaded, there is a regular race amongst the women, each striving not to be last. For she who places the last sheaf on the wagon is called the old man and is completely swathed in cornstalks. She is also decked with flowers, and a helmet of straw are placed on her head. In solemn procession, she carries the harvest crown to the squire, over whose head she holds it, while she utters a string of good wishes. At the dance, which follows, the old man has the right to choose his, or rather her, partner. It is an honor to dance with him. At Gomern, near Magdeburg, the reaper who cuts the last ears of corn is often wrapped up in cornstalks so completely that it is hard to see whether there is a man in the bundle or not. Thus wrapped up, he is taken by another stalwart reaper on his back and carried round the field amidst the joyous cries of the harvesters. At Neuhausen, near Merseburg, the person who binds the last sheaf is wrapped in ears of oats and saluted as the oatsman, whereupon the others dance round him. At Brie-Isle de France, the farmer himself is tied up in the first sheaf. At Dingelstedt, in the district of Erfurt, down to the first half of the 19th century, it was the custom to tie up a man in the last sheaf. He was called the old man, and was brought home on the last wagon, amid huzzas and music. On reaching the farmyard, he was rolled round the barn and drenched with water. At Nordlingen, in Bavaria, the man who gives the last stroke at threshing is wrapped in straw and rolled on the threshing floor. In some parts of Oberpfalz, Bavaria, he is said to get the old man, is wrapped in straw and carried to a neighbor who has not yet finished his threshing. In Silesia, the woman who binds the last sheaf has to submit to a good deal of horseplay. She is pushed, knocked down, and tied up in the sheaf, after which she is called the corn puppet, cornpuppel. In all these cases, the idea is that the spirit of the corn, the old man of vegetation, is driven out of the corn last cut or last threshed, and lives in the barn during the winter. At sowing time, he goes out again to the fields to resume his activity as animating force among the sprouting corn. 2. Passing to the second point of comparison between the Lytirsis story and European harvest customs, we have now to see that in the latter the corn spirit is often believed to be killed at reaping or threshing. In the Romsdal and other parts of Norway, when the haymaking is over, the people say that the old hayman has been killed. In some parts of Bavaria, the man who gives the last stroke at threshing is said to have killed the corn man, the oats man, or the wheat man, according to the crop. In the canton of Tillet, in Lorraine, as threshing the last corn, the men keep time with their flails, calling out as they thrash, "We are killing the old woman, we are killing the old woman." If there is an old woman in the house, she is warned to save herself, or she will be struck dead. Near Ragnit, in Lithuania, the last handful of corn is left standing by itself, with the words, "The old woman, Bough, is sitting in there." Then a young reaper whets his scythe, and with a strong sweep cuts down the handful. It is now said of him that he has cut off the Bobba's head, and he receives a gratuity from the farmer, and a jugful of water over his head from the farmer's wife. According to another account, every Lithuanian reaper makes haste to finish his task, for the old rye woman lives in the last stalks, and whoever cuts the last stalks kills the old rye woman, and by killing her he brings trouble on himself. In Wilkischken, in the district of Tilsit, the man who cuts the last corn goes by the name the killer of the rye woman. In Lithuania again, the corn spirit is believed to be killed at threshing as well as at reaping. When only a single pile of corn remains to be threshed, all the threshers suddenly step back a few paces, as if at the word of command. Then they fall to work, plying their flails with the utmost rapidity and vehemence, till they come to the last bundle. Upon this they fling themselves with almost frantic fury, straining every nerve and raining blows on it till the word "halt" rings out sharply from the leader. The man whose flail is the last to fall after the command to stop has been given is immediately surrounded by all the rest, crying out that he has struck the old rye woman dead. He has to expiate the deed by treating them to brandy, and like the man who cuts the last corn, he is known as the killer of the old rye woman. Sometimes in Lithuania, the slain corn spirit was represented by a puppet. Thus, a female figure was made out of corn stalks, dressed in clothes, and placed on the threshing floor, under the heap of corn which was to be threshed last. Whoever, thereafter, gave the last stroke at the threshing struck the old woman dead. We have already met with examples of burning the figure, which represents the corn spirit. In the East Riding of Yorkshire, a custom called burning the old witch is observed on the last day of harvest. A small sheaf of corn is burnt on the field in a fire of stubble. Peas are parched at the fire and eaten with a liberal allowance of ale, and the lads and lasses romp about the flames and amuse themselves by blackening each other's faces. Sometimes again, the corn spirit is represented by a man who lies down under the last corn. It is threshed upon his body, and the people say that the old man is being beaten to death. We saw that sometimes the farmer's wife is thrust together with the last sheaf under the threshing machine, as if to thresh her, and that afterwards a pretense is made of winnowing her. At Volders, in the Tyrol, husks of corn are stuck behind the neck of the man who gives the last stroke at threshing, and he is throttled with a straw garland. If he is tall, it is believed that the corn will be tall next year. Then he is tied on a bundle and flung into the river. In Carinthia, the thresher who gave the last stroke and the person who untied the last sheaf on the threshing floor are bound hand and foot with straw bands, and crowns of straw are placed on their heads. Then they are tied face to face on a sledge, dragged through the village, and flung into a brook. The custom of throwing the representative of the corn spirit into the stream, like that of drenching him with water, is, as usual, a rain charm. 3. Thus far the representatives of the corn spirit have generally been the man or woman who cuts, binds, or threshes the last corn. We now come to the cases in which the corn spirit is represented either by a stranger passing the harvest field, as in the Lytirsis tale, or by a visitor entering it for the first time. All over Germany, it is customary for the reapers or threshers to lay hold of passing strangers and bind them with a rope made of cornstalks till they pay a forfeit, and when the farmer himself or one of his guests enters the field or the threshing floor for the first time, he is treated in the same way. Sometimes the rope is only tied round his arm or his feet or his neck, but sometimes he is regularly swathed in corn. Thus at Salor in Norway, whoever enters the field, be he the master or a stranger, is tied up in a sheaf and must pay a ransom. In the neighborhood of Soest, when the farmer visits the flax pullers for the first time, he is completely enveloped in flax. Passers-by are also surrounded by the women, tied up in flax, and compelled to stand brandy. At Nordlingen, strangers are caught with straw ropes and tied up in a sheaf till they pay a forfeit. Among the Germans of Hasselberg in West Bohemia, as soon as a farmer had given the last corn to be threshed on the threshing floor, he was swathed in it and had to redeem himself by a present of cakes. In the canton of Putangus in Normandy, a pretense of tying up the owner of the land in the last sheaf of wheat is still practiced, or at least was still practiced some quarter of a century ago. The task falls to the women alone. They throw themselves on the proprietor, seize him by the arms, the legs, and the body, throw him to the ground, and stretch him on the last sheaf. Then a show is made of binding him, and the conditions to be observed at the harvest supper are dictated to him. When he has accepted them, he is released and allowed to get up. At Brie Isle de France, when anyone who does not belong to the farm passes by the harvest field, the reapers give chase. If they catch him, they bind him in a sheaf and bite him, one after the other, in the forehead, crying, "You shall carry the key of the field." To have the key is an expression used by harvesters elsewhere in the sense of to cut or bind or thresh the last sheaf. Hence, it is equivalent to the phrases, "You have the old man," "You are the old man," which are addressed to the cutter, binder, or thresher of the last sheaf. Therefore, when the stranger, as at Brie, is tied up in a sheaf and told that he will carry the key of the field, it is as much as to say that he is the old man, that is, an embodiment of the corn spirit. In hop picking, if a well-dressed stranger passes the hop yard, he is seized by the women, tumbled into the bin, covered with leaves, and not released till he has paid a fine. Thus, like the ancient Lytirsus, modern European reapers have been wont to lay hold of a passing stranger and tie him up in a sheaf. It is not to be expected that they should complete the parallel by cutting off his head, but if they do not take such a strong step, their language and gestures are at least indicative of a desire to do so. For instance, in Mecklenburg, on the first day of reaping, if the master or mistress or a stranger enters the field or merely passes by it, all the mowers face towards him and sharpen their scythes, clashing their wet stones against them in unison, as if they were making ready to mow. Then the woman who leads the mowers steps up to him and ties a band round his left arm. He must ransom himself by payment of a forfeit. Near Ratzburg, when the master or other person of mark enters the field or passes by it, all the harvesters stop work and march towards him in a body. The men, with their scythes in front. On meeting him, they form up in line, men and women. The men stick the poles of their scythes in the ground as they do in whetting them. Then they take off their caps and hang them on the scythes, while their leader stands forward and makes a speech. When he is done, they all whet their scythes in measured time very loudly, after which they put on their caps. Two of the women binders then come forward. One of them ties the master or stranger, as the case may be, with corn ears or with a silken band. The other delivers a rhyming address. The following are specimens of the speeches made by the reaper on these occasions. In some parts of Pomerania, every passer-by is stopped, his way being barred with a corn rope. The reapers form a circle round him and sharpen their scythes, while their leader says, "The men are ready, the scythes are bent, the corn is great and small, the gentlemen must be mowed." Then the process of whetting the scythes is repeated. At Ramin, in the district of Stettin, the stranger, standing encircled by the reapers, is thus addressed. "We'll stroke the gentleman with our naked sword, wherewith we shear meadows and fields. We shear princes and lords, labourers are often athirst. If the gentleman will stand beer and brandy, the joke will soon be over. But if our prayer he does not like, the sword has a right to strike." On the threshing floor, strangers are also regarded as embodiments of the corn spirit, and are treated accordingly. At Wiedinghard in Schleswig, when a stranger comes to the threshing floor, he is asked, "Shall I teach you the flail dance?" If he says yes, they put the arms of the threshing flail around his neck as if he were a sheaf of corn, and press them together so tight that he is nearly choked. In some parishes of Wermland, Sweden, when a stranger enters the threshing floor, where the threshers are at work, they say they will teach him the threshing song. Then they put a flail around his neck and a straw rope about his body. Also, as we have seen, if a stranger woman enters the threshing floor, the threshers put a flail around her body and a wreath of cornstalks round her neck, and call out, "See the corn woman, see! That is how the corn maiden looks." Thus, in these harvest customs of modern Europe, the person who cuts, binds, or threshes the last corn is treated as an embodiment of the corn spirit by being wrapped up in sheaves, killed in mimicry by agricultural implements, and thrown into the water. These coincidences with the Lytirsus story seem to prove that the latter is a genuine description of an old Frisian harvest custom. But since, in the modern parallels, the killing of the personal representative of the corn spirit is necessarily omitted, or at most enacted only in mimicry, it is desirable to show that in rude society, human beings have been commonly killed as an agricultural ceremony to promote the fertility of the fields. The following examples will make this plain. Subsection 3. Human sacrifices for the crops. The Indians of Guayaquil in Ecuador used to sacrifice human blood and the hearts of men when they sowed their fields. The people of Cañar, now Cuenca in Ecuador, used to sacrifice 100 children annually at harvest. The kings of Quito, the Incas of Peru, and for a long time the Spaniards were unable to suppress the bloody rite. At a Mexican harvest festival, when the first fruits of the season were offered to the sun, a criminal was placed between two immense stones, balanced opposite each other, and was crushed by them as they fell together. As remains were buried and a feast and dance followed, the sacrifice was known as the meeting of the stones. We have seen that the ancient Mexicans also sacrificed human beings at all the various stages in the growth of the maize, the age of the victims corresponding to the age of the corn, for they sacrificed newborn babes at sowing, older children when the grain had sprouted, and so on till it was fully ripe, when they sacrificed old men. No doubt, the correspondence between the ages of the victims and the state of the corn was supposed to enhance the efficacy of the sacrifice. The Pawnees annually sacrificed a human victim in spring when they sowed their fields. The sacrifice was believed to have been enjoined on them by the morning star, or by a certain bird, which the morning star had sent to them as its messenger. The bird was stuffed and preserved as a powerful talisman. They thought that an omission of this sacrifice would be followed by the total failure of the crops of maize, beans, and pumpkins. The victim was a captive of either sex. He was clad in the gayest and most costly attire, was fattened on the choicest food, and carefully kept in ignorance of his doom. When he was fat enough, they bound him to a cross in the presence of the multitude, danced a solemn dance, then cleft his head with a tomahawk and shot him with arrows. According to one trader, the squaws then cut pieces of flesh from the victim's body, with which they greased their hoes. But this was denied by another trader who had been present at the ceremony. Immediately after the sacrifice, the people proceeded to plant their fields. A particular account has been preserved by the sacrifice of a Sioux girl by the Pawnees in April 1837 or 1838. The girl was 14 or 15 years old and had been kept for 6 months and well treated. 2 days before the sacrifice, she was led from wigwam to wigwam, accompanied by the whole council of chiefs and warriors. At each lodge she received a small billet of wood and a little paint, which she handed to the warrior next to her. In this way she called at every wigwam, received at each the same present of wood and paint. On the 22nd of April, she was taken out to be sacrificed, attended by the warriors, each of whom carried 2 pieces of wood which he had received from her hands. Her body having been painted half red and half black, she was attached to a sort of gibbet and roasted for some time over a slow fire, then shot to death with arrows. The chief sacrificer next tore out her heart and devoured it. While her flesh was still warm, it was cut in small pieces from the bones, put in little baskets, and taken to a neighboring cornfield. There, the head chief took a piece of the flesh from a basket and squeezed a drop of blood upon the newly deposited grains of corn. His example was followed by the rest, till all the seed had been sprinkled with the blood. It was then covered up with the earth. According to one account, the body of the victim was reduced to a kind of paste, which was rubbed or sprinkled, not only on the maize, but also on the potatoes, the beans, and other seeds to fertilize them. By this sacrifice they hoped to obtain plentiful crops. A West African queen used to sacrifice a man and woman in the month of March. They were killed with spades and hoes, and their bodies buried in the middle of a field, which had just been tilled. at Lagos in Guinea. It was the custom annually to impale a young girl alive soon after the spring equinox in order to secure good crops. Along with her were sacrificed sheep and goats, which, with yams, heads of maize, and plantains, were hung on stakes on each side of her. The victims were bred up for the purpose in the king's seraglio, and their minds had been so powerfully wrought upon by the fetish men that they went cheerfully to their fate. A similar sacrifice used to be annually offered at Benin in Guinea. The Maramos, or Bakuna tribe, sacrificed a human being for the crops. The victim chosen is generally a short, stout man. He is seized by violence or intoxicated and taken to the fields, where he is killed amongst the wheat to serve as seed, so they phrase it. After his blood has coagulated in the sun, it is burned along with the frontal bone, the flesh attached to it, and the brain. The ashes are then scattered over the ground to fertilize it. The rest of the body is eaten. The Bagabos of Mindanao, one of the Philippine Islands, offer a human sacrifice before they sow their rice. The victim is a slave who is hewn to pieces in the forest. The natives of Bontoc, in the interior of Luzon, one of the Philippine Islands, are passionate headhunters. Their principal seasons for headhunting are the times of planting and reaping the rice. In order that the crop may turn out well, every farm must get at least one human head at planting and one at sowing. The headhunters go out in twos or threes, lie in wait for the victim, whether man or woman, cut off his or her head, hands, and feet, and bring them back in haste to the village, where they are received with great rejoicings. The skulls are at first exposed on the branches of 2 or 3 dead trees, which stand in an open space of every village, surrounded by large stones, which serve as seats. The people then dance round them and feast and get drunk. When the flesh has decayed from the head, the man who cut it off takes it home and preserves it as a relic, while his companions do the same with the hands and the feet. Similar customs are observed by the Apoyos, another tribe in the interior of Luzon. Among the Lotanaga, one of the many savage tribes who inhabit the deep, rugged, labyrinthine glens which wind into the mountains from the rich valley of Brahmaputra, it used to be a common custom to chop off the heads, hands, and feet of people they met with, and then to stick up the severed extremities in their fields to ensure a good crop of grain. There bore no ill will whatever to the persons upon whom they operated in this unceremonious fashion. Once they flayed a boy alive, carved him in pieces, and distributed the flesh among all the villagers, who put it in their corn bins to avert bad luck and ensure plentiful crops of grain. The Gonds of India, a Dravidian race, kidnapped Brahmin boys and kept them as victims to be sacrificed on various occasions. At sowing and reaping, after a triumphal procession, one of the lads was slain by being punctured with a poisoned arrow. His blood was often sprinkled over the plowed field or the ripe crop, and his flesh was devoured. The Orions, or Urians, of Chota Nagpur, worship a goddess called Anakuare, who can give good crops and make a man rich, but to induce her to do so, it is necessary to offer human sacrifices. In spite of the vigilance of the British government, these sacrifices are said to be still secretly perpetrated. The victims are poor waifs and strays whose disappearance attracts no notice. April and May are the months when the catchpoles are out on the prowl. At that time, strangers will not go about the country alone, and parents will not let their children enter the jungle or herd the cattle. When a catchpole has found a victim, he cuts his throat and carries away the upper part of the ring finger and the nose. The goddess takes up her abode in the house of any man who has offered her a sacrifice, and from that time his fields yield a double harvest. The form she assumes in the house is that of a small child. When the householder brings in his unhusked rice, he takes the goddess and rolls her over the heap to double its size. But she soon grows restless and can only be pacified with the blood of fresh human victims. But the best known case of human sacrifices, systemically offered to ensure good crops, is supplied by the Khans, or Khans, another Dravidian race in Bengal. Our knowledge of them is derived from the accounts written by British officers who, about the middle of the 19th century, were engaged in putting them down. The sacrifices were offered to the earth goddess, Tari Panu or Barapanu, and were believed to ensure good crops and immunity from all disease and accidents. In particular, they were considered necessary in the cultivation of turmeric, the Khans arguing that the turmeric could not have a deep red color without the shedding of blood. The victim, or Moriah, as he was called, was acceptable to the goddess only if he had been purchased, or had been born a victim, that is, the son of a victim father, or had been devoted as a child by his father or guardian. Khans in distress often sold their children for victims, considering the beatification of their souls certain and their death for the benefit of mankind the most honorable possible. A man of the Panua tribe was once seen to load a Khan with curses, and finally to spit in his face, because the Khan had sold for a victim his own child, whom the Panua had wished to marry. A party of Khans who saw this immediately pressed forward to comfort the seller of his child, saying, "Your child has died that all the world may live, and the earth goddess herself will wipe that spittle from your face." The victims were often kept for years before they were sacrificed. Being regarded as consecrated beings, they were treated with extreme affection, mingled with deference, and were welcomed wherever they went. A Moriah youth, on attaining maturity, was generally given a wife, who was herself usually a Moriah or victim, and with her he received a portion of land and farm stock. Their offspring were also victims. Human sacrifices were offered to the earth goddess by tribes, branches of tribes, or villages, both at periodical festivals and on extraordinary occasions. The periodical sacrifices were generally so arranged by tribes and divisions of tribes that each head of family was enabled, at least once a year, to procure a shred of flesh for his fields, generally about the time when his chief crop had laid down. The mode of performing these tribal sacrifices was as follows. 10 or 12 days before the sacrifice, the victim was devoted by cutting off his hair, which, until then, had been kept unshorn. Crowds of men and women assembled to witness the sacrifice. None might be excluded, since the sacrifice was declared to be for all mankind. It was preceded by several days of wild revelry and gross debauchery. On the day before the sacrifice, the victim, dressed in a new garment, was led forth from the village in solemn procession, with music and dancing, to the Moriah Grove, a clump of high forest trees, standing a little way from the village and untouched by the axe. There, they tied him to a post which was sometimes placed between two plants of the sankasar shrub. He was then anointed with oil, ghee, and turmeric, and adorned with flowers, and a species of reverence, which it is not easy to distinguish from adoration, was paid to him throughout the day. A great struggle now arose to obtain the smallest relic from his person, a particle of the turmeric paste with which he was smeared, or a drop of his spittle, was esteemed of sovereign virtue, especially by the women. The crowd danced round the post to music, and addressing the earth, said, "O God, we offer this sacrifice to you. Give us good crops, seasons, and health." Then, speaking to the victim, they say, "We bought you with a price and did not seize you. Now we sacrifice you according to custom, and no sin rests with us." On the last morning, the orgies, which had been scarcely interrupted during the night, were resumed and continued till noon, when they ceased, and the assembly proceeded to consummate the sacrifice. The victim was again anointed with oil, and each person touched the anointed part, and wiped the oil on his own head. In some places they took the victim in procession round the village, from door to door, where some plucked hair from his head, and others begged for a drop of his spittle, with which they anointed their heads. As the victim might not be bound, nor make any show of resistance, the bones of his arms, and, if necessary, his legs, were broken, but often his precaution was rendered unnecessary by stupefying him with opium. The mode of putting him to death varied in different places. One of the commonest modes seems to have been strangulation, or squeezing to death. The branch of a green tree was cleft several feet down the middle. The victim's neck, in other places his chest, was inserted in the cleft, which the priest, aided by his assistants, strove with all his force to close. Then he wounded the victim slightly with his axe, whereupon the crowd rushed at the wretch and hewed the flesh from the bones, leaving the head and bowels untouched. Sometimes he was cut up alive. In Chinnikimity, he was dragged along the field, surrounded by the crowd, who, avoiding his head and intestines, hacked the flesh from his body with their knives till he died. Another very common mode of sacrifice in the same district was to fasten the victim to the proboscis of a wooden elephant, which revolved on a stout post, and as it whirled round, the crowd cut the flesh from the victim while life remained. In some villages, Major Campbell found as many as 14 of these wooden elephants, which had been used at sacrifices. In one district, the victim was put to death slowly by fire. A low stage was formed, sloping on either side like a roof. Upon it they laid the victim, his limbs wound round with cords to confine his struggles. Fires were then lighted, and hot brands applied to make him roll up and down the slopes of the stage as long as possible, for the more tears he shed, the more abundant would be the supply of rain. Next day the body was cut to pieces. The flesh cut from the victim was instantly taken home by the persons who had been deputed by each village to bring it. To secure its rapid arrival, it was sometimes forwarded by relays of men and conveyed with postal fleetness 50 or 60 miles. In each village, all who stayed at home fastened rigidly until the flesh arrived. The bearer deposited it in the place of public assembly, where it was received by the priest and the heads of families. The priest divided it into 2 portions, one of which he offered to the earth goddess by burying it in a hole in the ground with his back turned and without looking. Then each man added a little earth to bury it, and the priest poured water on the spot from a hill gourd. The other portion of flesh he divided into as many shares as there were heads of houses present. Each head of a house rolled his shred of flesh and leaves and buried it in his favorite field, placing it in the earth behind his back without looking. In some places, each man carried his portion of flesh to the stream, which watered his fields, and there hung it on a pole. For 3 days thereafter, no house was swept, and in one district, strict silence was observed. No fire might be given out, no wood cut, no strangers received. The remains of the human victim, namely the head, bowels, and bones, were watched by strong parties the night after the sacrifice, and next morning they were burned, along with a whole sheep, on a funeral pile. The ashes were scattered over the fields, laid as paste over the houses and granaries, or mixed with the new corn to preserve it from insects. Sometimes, however, the head and bones were buried, not burnt. After the suppression of the human sacrifices, inferior victims were substituted in some places. For instance, in the capital of Tenochimedy, a goat took the place of the human victim. Others sacrifice a buffalo. They tie it to a wooden post in a sacred grove, dance wildly round it with brandished knives, then, falling on the living animal, hack it to shreds and tatters in a few minutes, fighting and struggling with each other for every particle of flesh. As soon as a man has secured a piece, he makes off with it at full speed to bury it in his fields, according to ancient custom, before the sun has set, and as some of them have far to go, they must run very fast. All the women throw clods of earth at the rapidly retreating figures of the men, some of them taking very good aim. Soon the sacred grove, so lately a scene of tumult, is silent and deserted except for a few people who remain to guard all that is left of the buffalo, to wit, the head, the bones, and the stomach, which are burned with ceremony at the foot of the stake. In these Khan sacrifices, the Mariahs are represented by our authorities as victims offered to propitiate the earth goddess. But from the treatment of the victims, both before and after death, it appears that the custom cannot be explained as merely a propitiatory sacrifice. A part of the flesh certainly was offered to the earth goddess, but the rest was buried by each householder in his fields, and the ashes of the other parts of the body were scattered over the fields, laid as paste on the granaries, or mixed with the new corn. These latter customs imply that to the body of the Mariah there was ascribed a direct or intrinsic power of making the crops to grow, quite independent of the indirect efficacy which it might have as an offering to secure the goodwill of the deity. In other words, the flesh and ashes of the victim were believed to be endowed with a magical or physical power of fertilizing the land. The same intrinsic power was ascribed to the blood and tears of the Mariah, his blood causing the redness of the turmeric and his tears producing rain, for it can hardly be doubted that, originally at least, the tears were supposed to bring down the rain, not merely to prognosticate it. Similarly, the custom of pouring water on the buried flesh of the Mariah was no doubt a rain charm. Again, magical power, as an attribute of the Mariah, appears in the sovereign virtue believed to reside in anything that came from his person, as his hair or spittle. The ascription of such power to the Mariah indicates that he was much more than a mere man sacrificed to propitiate a deity. Once more, the extreme reverence paid him points to the same conclusion. Major Campbell speaks of the Mariah as being regarded as something more than mortal. And Major Macpherson says a species of reverence, which it is not easy to distinguish from adoration, is paid to him. In short, the Mariah seems to have been regarded as divine. As such, he may originally have represented the earth goddess, or perhaps a deity of vegetation, though in later times he came to be regarded rather as a victim offered to a deity than as himself an incarnate god. This later view of the Mariah as a victim rather than a divinity may perhaps have received undue emphasis from the European writers who have described the Khan religion, habituated to the later idea of sacrifice as an offering made to a god for the purpose of conciliating his favor. European observers are apt to interpret all religious slaughter in this sense, and to suppose that wherever such slaughter takes place, there must necessarily be a deity to whom the carnage is believed by the slayers to be acceptable. Thus, their preconceived ideas may unconsciously color and warp their descriptions of savage rites. The same custom of killing the representative of a god, of which strong traces appear in the Khan sacrifices, may perhaps be detected in some of the other human sacrifices described above. Thus, the ashes of the slaughtered Marimo were scattered over the fields. The blood of the Brahmin lad was put on the crop and field. The flesh of the slain Naga was stowed in the corn bin, and the blood of the Sioux girl was allowed to trickle on the seed. Again, the identification of the victim with the corn, in other words, the view that he is an embodiment or spirit of the corn, is brought out in the pains which seem to be taken to secure a physical correspondence between him and the natural object which he embodies or represents. Thus, the Mexicans killed young victims for the young corn and old ones for the ripe corn. The Maramos sacrificed as seed a short fat man, the shortness of his stature corresponding to that of the young corn, his fatness to the condition which it is desired that the crops may attain, and the Pawnees fatten their victims probably with the same view. Again, the identification of the victim with the corn comes out in the African custom of killing him with spades and hoes, and the Mexican custom of grinding him like corn between two stones. One more point in these savage customs deserves to be noted. The Pawnee chief devoured the heart of the Sioux girl, and the Maramos and Gons ate the victim's flesh. If, as we suppose, the victim was regarded as divine, it follows that in eating his flesh, his worshippers believed themselves to be partaking of the body of their god. Subsection 4. The corn spirit slain in his human representatives. The barbarous rites just described offer analogies to the harvest customs of Europe. Thus, the fertilizing virtue ascribed to the corn spirit is shown equally in the savage custom of mixing the victim's blood or ashes with the seed corn, and the European custom of mixing the grain from the last sheaf with the young corn in spring. Again, the identification of the person with the corn appears alike in the savage custom of adapting the age and stature of the victim to the age and stature, whether actual or expected, of the crop. In the Scotch and Styrian rules that when the corn spirit is conceived as the maiden, the last corn shall be cut by a young maiden, but when it's conceived as the corn mother, it shall be cut by an old woman, is the warning given to old women in Lorraine to save themselves when the old woman is being killed. That is, when the last corn is being threshed, and in the Tyrolese expectation that if the man who gives the last stroke at threshing is tall, the next year's corn will be tall also. Further, the same identification is implied in the savage custom of killing the representative of the corn spirit with hoes or spades, or by grinding him between stones, and in the European custom of pretending to kill him with the scythe or the flail. Once more, the Khan custom of pouring water on the buried flesh of the victim is parallel to the European customs of pouring water on the personal representative of the corn spirit, or plunging him into a stream. Both the Khan and the European customs are rain charms. To return now to the Lytirsus story, it has been shown that in rude society, human beings have been commonly killed to promote the growth of the crops. There is, therefore, no improbability in the supposition that they may once have been killed for a like purpose in Frisia and Europe. And when Frisian legend and European folk custom, closely agreeing with each other, point to the conclusion that men were so slain, we are bound, provisionally at least, to accept the conclusion. Further, both the Lytirsus story and European harvest customs agree in indicating that the victim was put to death as a representative of the corn spirit, and this indication is in harmony with the view which some savages appear to take of the victim slain to make the crops flourish. On the whole, then, we may fairly suppose that both in Frisia and in Europe, the representative of the corn spirit was annually killed upon the harvest field. Grounds have been already shown for believing that similarly in Europe, the representative of the tree spirit was annually slain. The proofs of these two remarkable and closely analogous customs are entirely independent of each other. Their coincidence seems to furnish fresh presumption in favor of both. To the question, how was the representative of the corn spirit chosen? One answer has already been given. Both the Lytirsus story and European folk customs show that passing strangers were regarded as manifestations of the corn spirit escaping from the cut or threshed corn, and as such were seized and slain. But this is not the only answer which the evidence suggests. According to the Frisian legend, the victims of Lytirsus were not simply passing strangers, but persons whom he had vanquished in a reaping contest, and afterwards wrapped up in corn sheaves and beheaded. This suggests that the representative of the corn spirit may have been selected by means of a competition on the harvest field, in which the vanquished competitor was compelled to accept the fatal honor. The supposition is countenanced by European harvest customs. We have seen that in Europe, there is sometimes a contest amongst the reapers to avoid being last, and that the person who is vanquished in this competition, that is, who cuts the last corn, is often roughly handled. It is true, we have not found that a pretense is made of killing him, but on the other hand, we have found that a pretense is made of killing the man who gives the last stroke at threshing, that is, who is vanquished in the threshing contest. Now, since it is in the character of representative of the corn spirit that the thresher of the last corn is slain in mimicry, and since the same representative character attaches, as we have seen, to the cutter and binder, as well as to the thresher of the last corn, and since the same repugnance is evinced by harvesters to be last in any one of these labors, we may conjecture that a pretense has been commonly made of killing the reaper and binder as well as the thresher of the last corn, and that in ancient times this killing was actually carried out. This conjecture is corroborated by the common superstition that whoever cuts the last corn must die soon. Sometimes it is thought that the person who binds the last sheaf on the field will die in the course of the next year. The reason for fixing on the reaper, binder, or thresher of the last corn as the representative of the corn spirit may be this. The corn spirit is supposed to lurk as long as he can in the corn, retreating before the reapers and binders and the threshers at their work. But when he is forcibly expelled from his refuge in the last corn cut or the last sheaf bound, or the last grain threshed, he necessarily assumes some other form than that of the cornstalks, which had hitherto been his garment or body. And what form can the expelled corn spirit assume more naturally than that of the person who stands nearest to the corn from which he, the corn spirit, has just been expelled? But the person in question is necessarily the reaper, binder, or thresher of the last corn. He or she, therefore, is seized and treated as the corn spirit himself. Thus, the person who was killed on the harvest field as the representative of the corn spirit may have been either a passing stranger or the harvester who was last at reaping, binding, or threshing. But there is a third possibility to which ancient legend and modern folk custom alike point. Lytirsus not only put strangers to death, he was himself slain, and apparently in the same way as he had slain others. Namely, he being wrapped in a corn sheaf, beheaded and cast into the river, and it is implied that this happened to Lytirsus on his own land. Similarly, in modern harvest customs, the pretense of killing appears to be carried out quite as often on the person of the master, farmer or squire, as on that of strangers. Now, when we remember that Lytirsus was said to have been a son of the king of Frisia, and that in one account he is himself called a king, and when we combine with this the tradition that he was put to death, apparently as a representative of the corn spirit, we are led to conjecture that we have here another trace of the custom of annually slaying one of those divine or priestly kings who are known to have held ghostly sway in many parts of Western Asia, and particularly in Frisia. The custom appears, as we have seen, to be one so far modified in places that the king's son was slain in the king's stead. Of the custom thus modified, the story of Lytirsus would be, in one version at least, a reminiscence. Turning now to the relation of the Frisian Lytirsus to the Frisian Attis, it may be remembered that at Pessinus, the seat of a priestly kingship, the high priest appears to have been annually slain in the character of Attis, a god of vegetation, and that Attis was described by an ancient authority as a reaped ear of corn. Thus Attis, as embodiment of the corn spirit, annually slain in the person of his representative, might be thought to be ultimately identical with Lytirsus, the latter being simply the rustic prototype out of which the state religion of Attis was developed. It may have been so, but on the other hand, the analogy of European folk custom warns us that amongst the same people, two distinct deities of vegetation may have their separate personal representatives, both of whom are slain in the character of gods at different times of the year. For in Europe, as we have seen, it appears that one man was commonly slain in the character of the tree spirit in spring, and another in the character of the corn spirit in autumn. It may have been so in Frisia also. Attis was especially a tree god, and his connection with corn may have been only such an extension of the power of a tree spirit, as is indicated in customs like the harvest May. Again, the representative of Attis appears to have been slain in spring, whereas Lytirsus must have been slain in summer or autumn, according to the time of the harvest in Frisia. On the whole, then, while we are not justified in regarding Lytirsus as the prototype of Attis, the two may be regarded as parallel products of the same religious idea, and may have stood to each other as in Europe the old man of harvest stands to the wild man, the leaf man, and so forth of spring. Both were spirits or deities of vegetation, and the personal representatives of both were annually slain. But whereas the Attis worship became elevated into the dignity of a state religion and spread to Italy, the rites of Lytirsus seem never to have passed the limits of their native Frisia, and always retained their character of rustic ceremonies performed by peasants on the harvest field. At most, a few villages may have clubbed together, as amongst the Khans, to procure a human victim to be slain as representative of the corn spirit for their common benefit. Such victims may have been drawn from the families of priestly kings or kinglets, which would account for the legendary character of Lytirsus as the son of a Frisian king, or as himself a king. When villages did not so club together, each village or farm may have procured its own representative of the corn spirit by dooming to death either a passing stranger or the harvester who cut, bound, or threshed the last sheaf. Perhaps in the olden time, the practice of head-hunting as a means of promoting the growth of the corn may have been as common among the rude inhabitants of Europe and Western Asia as it still is, or was till lately, among the primitive agricultural tribes of Assam, Burma, the Philippine Islands, and the Indian archipelago. It is hardly necessary to add that in Frisia, as in Europe, the old barbarous custom of killing a man on the harvest field or the threshing floor had doubtless passed into a mere pretense long before the classical era, and was probably regarded by the reapers and the threshers themselves as no more than a rough jest, which the license of a harvest home permitted them to play off on a passing stranger, a comrade, or even on their master himself. I have dwelt on the Lytirsus song at length because it affords so many points of comparison with European and savage folk custom. The other harvest songs of Western Asia and Egypt, to which attention has been called above, may now be dismissed much more briefly. The similarity of the Bithynian Bormus to the Frisian Lytirsus helps to bear out the interpretation which has been given of the latter. Bormus, whose death, or rather disappearance, was annually mourned by the reapers in a plaintive song, was, like Lytirsus, a king's son, or at least the son of a wealthy and distinguished man. The reapers, whom he watched, were at work on his own fields, and he disappeared in going to fetch water for them. According to one version of the story, he was carried off by the nymphs, doubtless the nymphs of the spring or pool or river, whither he went to draw water. Viewed in the light of the Lytirsus story and European folk custom, the disappearance of Bormus may be a reminiscence of the custom of binding the farmer himself in a corn sheaf and throwing him into the water. The mournful strain which the reapers sang was probably a lamentation over the death of the corn spirit, slain either in the cut corn or in the person of a human representative, and the call which they addressed to him may have been a prayer that he might return in fresh vigor next year. The Phoenician Linus song was sung at the vintage, at least in the west of Asia Minor, as we learn from Homer, and this, combined with the legend of Silius, suggests that in ancient times passing strangers were handled by vintagers and vine-diggers in much the same way as they are said to have been handled by the reaper Lytirsus. The Lydian Silius, so ran the legend, compelled passers-by to dig for him in his vineyard, till Hercules came and killed him, and dug up his vines by the roots. This seems to be the outline of a legend like that of Lytirsus, but neither ancient writer nor modern folk custom enable us to fill in the details. But further, the Linus song was probably sung also by Phoenician reapers, for Herodotus compares it to the Maneros song, which, as we have seen, was a lament raised by Egyptian reapers over the cut corn. Further, Linus was identified with Adonis, and Adonis has some claims to be regarded as especially a corn deity. Thus, the Linus lament, as sung at harvest, would be identical with the Adonis lament. Each would be the lamentation raised by reapers over the dead spirit of the corn. But whereas Adonis, like Attis, grew into a stately figure of mythology, adored and mourned in splendid cities, far beyond the limits of his Phoenician home, Linus appears to have remained a simple ditty sung by reapers and vintagers among the corn sheaves and the vines. The analogy of Lytirsus and of folk custom, both European and savage, suggests that in Phoenicia, the slain corn spirit, the dead Adonis, may formerly have been represented by a human victim, and this suggestion is probably supported by the Haran legend that Tammuz, Adonis, was slain by his cruel lord, who ground his bones in a mill and scattered them to the wind. For in Mexico, as we have seen, the human victim at harvest was crushed between two stones, and both in Africa and India, the ashes or other remains of the victim were scattered over the fields. But the Haran legend may be only a mythical way of expressing the grinding of corn in the mill and the scattering of the seed. It seems worth suggesting that the mock king, who was annually killed at the Babylonian festival of the Sacaea on the 16th day of the month Luz, would have represented Tammuz himself. For the historian Berosus, who records the festival and its date, probably used the Macedonian calendar, since he dedicated his history to Antiochus Soter, and in his day, the Macedonian month Loos appears to have corresponded to the Babylonian month Tammuz. If this conjecture is right, the view that the mock king at the Sacaea was slain in the character of a god would be established. There is a good deal more evidence that in Egypt the slain corn spirit, the dead Osiris, was represented by a human victim, whom the reapers slew on the harvest field, mourning his death in a dirge, to which the Greeks, through a verbal misunderstanding, gave the name Maneros. For the legend of Busiris seems to preserve a reminiscence of human sacrifices once offered by the Egyptians in connection with the worship of Osiris Bursis. For the legend of Busiris seems to preserve a reminiscence of human sacrifices once offered by the Egyptians in connection with the worship of Osiris. Busiris was said to have been an Egyptian king who sacrificed all strangers on the altar of Zeus. The origin of the custom was traced to a dearth which afflicted the land of Egypt for 9 years. A Cyprian seer informed Busiris that the death would cease if a man were annually sacrificed to Zeus. So Busiris instituted the sacrifice. But when Hercules came to Egypt and was being dragged to the altar to be sacrificed, he burst his bonds and slew Busiris and his son. Here, then, is a legend that in Egypt a human victim was annually sacrificed to prevent the failure of their crops, and a belief is implied that an omission of the sacrifice would have entailed a recurrence of that infertility, which it was the object of the sacrifice to prevent. So the Pawnees, as we have seen, believed that an omission of the human sacrifice at planting would have been followed by a total failure of their crops. The name Busiris was in reality the name of a city, Pe-Asar, the house of Osiris, the city being so called because it contained the grave of Osiris. Indeed, some high modern authorities believe that Busiris was the original home of Osiris, from which his worship spread to other parts of Egypt. The human sacrifice were said to have been offered at his grave, and the victims were red-haired men, whose ashes were scattered abroad by means of winnowing fans. This tradition of human sacrifices offered at the tomb of Osiris is confirmed by the evidence of the monuments. In the light of the foregoing discussion, the Egyptian tradition of Busiris admits of a consistent and fairly probable explanation. Osiris, the corn spirit, was annually represented at harvest by a stranger, whose red hair made him a suitable representative of the ripe corn. This man, in his representative character, was slain on the harvest field and mourned by the reapers, who prayed at the same time that the corn spirit might revive and return, Ma'a-ne-ra, Maneros, with renewed vigor in the following year. Finally, the victim, or some part of him, was burned and the ashes scattered by winnowing fans over the fields to fertilize them. Here the choice of the victim on the ground of his resemblance to the corn, which he was to represent, agrees with the Mexican and African customs already described. Similarly, the woman who died in the character of the corn mother at the Mexican midsummer sacrifice had her face painted red and yellow in token of the colors of the corn, and she wore a pasteboard mitre, surmounted by waving plumes in imitation of the tassel of the maize. On the other hand, at the festival of the goddess of the white maize, the Mexicans pagans sacrificed lepers. The Romans sacrificed red-haired puppies in spring to avert the supposed blight influence of the dog star, believing that the crops would thus grow ripe and ruddy. The heathen of Haran offered to the sun, moon, and planets human victims who were chosen on the ground of their supposed resemblance to the heavenly bodies to which they were sacrificed. For example, the priests, clothed in red and smeared with blood, offered a red-haired, red-cheeked man to the red planet Mars. In a temple, which was painted red and draped with red hangings, these and the like cases of assimilating the victim to the god or to the natural phenomenon which he represents are based ultimately on the principle of homeopathic or imitative magic, the notion being that the object aimed at will be most readily attained by means of a sacrifice which resembles the effect that it is designed to bring out. The story that the fragments of Osiris's body were scattered up and down the land and buried by Isis on the spots where they lay may very well be a reminiscence of a custom, like that observed by the Khans, of dividing the human victim in pieces and burying the pieces, often at intervals of many miles from each other, in the fields. Thus, if I am right, the key to the mysteries of Osiris is furnished by the melancholy cry of the Egyptian reapers, which down to Roman times could be heard year after year, sounding across the fields, announcing the death of the corn spirit, the rustic prototype of Osiris. Similar cries, as we have seen, were also heard on all the harvest fields of Western Asia. By the ancients, they are spoken of as songs, but to judge from the analysis of the names Linus and Maneros, they probably consisted only of a few words uttered in a prolonged musical note, which could be heard at a great distance. Such sonorous and long-drawn cries, raised by a number of strong voices in concert, must have had a striking effect, and could hardly fail to arrest the attention of any wayfarer who happened to be within hearing. The sounds, repeated again and again, could probably be distinguished with tolerable ease, even at a distance. But to a Greek traveler in Asia or Egypt, the foreign words would commonly convey no meaning, and he might take them, not unnaturally, for the name of someone, Maneros, Linus, Latirsus, Bormus, upon whom the reapers were calling. And if his journey led him through more countries than one, as Bithynia and Phrygia or Phoenicia and Egypt, while the corn was being reaped, he would have an opportunity of comparing the various harvest cries of the different peoples. Thus, we can readily understand why these harvest cries were so often noted and compared with each other by the Greeks, whereas, if they had been regular songs, they could not have been heard at such distances, and therefore could not have attracted the attention of so many travelers, and moreover, even if the wayfarer were within hearing of them, he could not so easily have picked out the words. Down to recent times, Devonshire reapers uttered cries of the same sort, and performed on the field a ceremony exactly analogous to that in which, if I am not mistaken, the rites of Osiris originated. The cry and the ceremony are thus described by an observer who wrote in the first half of the 19th century. After the wheat is all cut on most farms in the north of Devon, the harvest people have a custom of crying the neck. I believe that this practice is seldom omitted on any large farm in that part of the country. It is done in this way. An old man or someone else well acquainted with the ceremonies used on the occasion, when the laborers are reaping the last field of wheat, goes round to the shocks and sheaves and picks out a little bundle of all the best ears he can find. This bundle he ties up very neat and trim, and plats and arranges the straws very tastefully. This is called the neck of wheat, or wheaten ears. After the field is cut out, and the pitcher once more circulated, the reapers, binders, and the women stand round in a circle. The person with the neck stands in the center, grasping it with both hands. He first stoops and holds it near the ground, and all the men forming the ring take off their hats, stooping and holding them with both hands towards the ground. They then all begin at once in a very prolonged and harmonious tone to cry, the neck, at the same time slowly raising themselves upright and elevating their arms and hats above their heads, the person with the neck also raising it on high. This is done 3 times. They then change their cry to wei yen, which they sound in the same prolonged and slow manner as before, the singular harmony in effect 3 times. This last cry is accompanied by the same movements of the body and arms as in crying the neck. After having thus repeated the neck 3 times and wei yen or wei yen as often, they all burst out into a kind of loud and joyous laugh, flinging up their hats and caps into the air, capering about and perhaps kissing the girls. One of them then gets the neck, and runs as hard as he can down to the farmhouse, where the dairymaid, or one of the young female domestics, stands at the door prepared with a pail of water. If he who holds the neck can manage to get into the house in any way unseen or openly by any other way than the door at which the girl stands with the pail of water, then he may lawfully kiss her, but if otherwise, he is regularly soused with the contents of the bucket. On a fine, still autumn evening, the crying of the neck has a wonderful effect at a distance, far finer than that of the Turkish muezzin, which Lord Byron eulogizes so much, and which he says is preferable to all the bells of Christendom. I have once or twice heard upwards of 20 men cry it, and sometimes joined by an equal number of female voices. About 3 years back, on some high grounds, where our people were harvesting, I heard 6 or 7 necks cried in one night, although I know that some of them were 4 miles off. They are heard through the quiet evening air at a considerable distance sometimes. Again, Mrs. Bray tells how, travelling in Devonshire, she saw a party of reapers standing in a circle on a rising ground, holding her sickles aloft. One in the middle held up some ears of corn tied together with flowers, and the party shouted 3 times, what she writes as, "Arnack, Arnack, Arnack, we haven, we haven, we haven." They went home, accompanied by women and children carrying boughs of flowers, shouting and singing. The manservant who attended Mrs. Bray said it was only the people making their games, as they always did, to the spirit of harvest. Here, as Miss Byrne remarks, Arnack we haven is obviously in the Devon dialect a neck or knack, we haven. Another account of this old custom, written at Truro in 1839, runs thus. Now, when all the corn was cut in Helligan, the farming men and maidens come in front of the house, and bring with them a small sheaf of corn, the last that has been cut, and this is adorned with ribbons and flowers, and one part is tied quite tight, so as to look like a neck. Then they cry out, my side, as loud as they can. Then the dairymaid gives the neck to the head farming man. He takes it and says very loudly 3 times, I have him, I have him, I have him. Then another farming man shouts very loudly, What have ye? What have ye? What have ye? Then the first says, A neck, a neck, a neck. And when he has said this, all the people make a very great shouting. This they do 3 times, and after one famous shout, go away and eat supper, and dance and sing songs. According to another account, all went out to the field when the last corn was cut. The neck was tied with ribbons and plaited, and they danced round it, and carried it to the great kitchen, where by and by the supper was. The words were as given in the previous account, and hip, hip, heck, heck, I have ye, I have ye, I have ye. It was hung up in the hall. Another account relates that one of the men rushed from the field with the last sheaf, while the rest pursued him with vessels of water, which they tried to throw over the sheaf before it could be brought into the barn. In the foregoing customs, a particular bunch of ears, generally the last left standing, is conceived as the neck of the corn spirit, who is consequently beheaded when the bunch is cut down. Similarly, in Shropshire, the name neck, or the gander's neck, used to be commonly given to the last handful of ears left standing in the middle of the field, when all the rest of the corn was cut. It was plaited together, and the reapers, standing 10 or 20 paces off, threw their sickles at it. Whoever cut it through was said to have cut off the gander's neck. The neck was taken to the farmer's wife, who was supposed to keep it in the house for good luck till the next harvest came round. Near Treves, the man who reaps the last standing corn cuts the goat's neck off. At Faslane, on the Gairloch, Dumbartonshire, the last handful of standing corn was sometimes called the head. At Aurich, in East Friesland, the man who reaps the last corn cuts the hare's tail off. In mowing down the last corner of the field, French reapers sometimes call out, We have the cat by the tail. In Brest, Bourgogne, the last sheaf represented the fox. Beside it, a score of ears were left standing to form the tail, and each reaper, going back some paces, threw his sickle at it. He who succeeded in severing it cut off the fox's tail, and a cry of "You coo, coo" was raised in his honor. These examples leave no room to doubt the meaning of the Devonshire and Cornish expression, the neck, as applied to the last sheaf. The corn spirit is conceived in human or animal form, and the last standing corn is part of its body, its neck, its head, or its tail. Sometimes, as we have seen, the last corn is regarded as the navel string. Lastly, the Devonshire custom of drenching with water the person who brings in the neck is a rain charm, such as we have had many examples of. Its parallel in the Mysteries of Osiris was the custom of pouring water on the image of Osiris or on the person who represented him. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Midwest Covencast Presents Weekend Reads. We will be back in 2 weeks with our next installment. In the meantime, you can catch up with our other pod, Midwest Covencast. Consider supporting Midwest Covencast and Weekend Reads on our Patreon to gain access to additional content and exclusive Coven merch. You can even join our Coven by following us on social media at Midwest Covencast on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, and at Midwest Coven on Twitter. You can also keep up with us on our website, MidwestCovencast.com. Until next time, Coven, blessed be.